All right, good afternoon. My name is Matthew Lowry, and today I'm going to be responding to the claim that the early release of prisoners in California will benefit the state. My opponent's three supporting claims were: first, that the early release of prisoners will reduce costs to the state; second, that releasing prisoners with less serious crimes will create space for those more serious offenders; and third, that the early release of prisoners does not harm the state and people. So first, I'd like to respond to her first supporting claim, that the early release of prisoners will reduce costs to the state, and I would like to prove that she failed to prove this claim. First off, she used there was an unreliable quotation. My opponent quoted that the growth in spending on corrections and state budgets exceeds that for education, healthcare, social services, transportation, and environmental protection. However, according to the California State Controller's Office, the budget for the correction system has only increased by $4 billion since 2004, while that for education alone has increased by $9 billion. And what this just goes to show is that even if they were to reduce the number of inmates in prison, that the savings from that would not be, at least the growth in spending on corrections would not be stemmed as quickly. Also, I think it's important to point out that she made the assumption that because so much money is spent on each inmate in California, a sum of approximately $47,000 per year, that releasing inmates will save this money for the state. The idea being that every inmate that is released early saves the state another $47,000 per year. However, one of the things that she failed to consider, and an extremely important fact, is that a lot of the inmates in prison are either mentally ill or drug dependent. According to a report by the National Research Council, 56% of inmates in state prisons are mentally ill or drug dependent. And if these individuals are released from prison without opportunities for rehabilitation, employment services, and things of that nature, which the state would have to support financially, then they would likely either end up on the street or end up back in prison. According to the Legislative Analyst Office, more than 90,000 parolees reoffend and are reincarcerated every year, and most of these are drug-related offenses. So next, I'd like to talk about her second supporting claim, that the release of prisoners early with less serious crimes will create space for those more serious offenders. First off, she used some outdated and unreliable information. She stated that there are 170,000 inmates in California's 33 prisons, which were designed to hold 100,000. But according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, as of January 27, 2016, so this is not very long ago, the total number of inmates in custody is only 122,000, which is 40% less than claimed. And what this means is that although overcrowding is still an issue, it's not as big of a problem as the picture that was painted before. Similarly, according to Mark Maurer, the executive director of the Sentencing Project, half the people in state prisons today have been convicted of a violent offense nationwide. And if we look at California, according to the Public Policy Institute of California, as of 2013, 90% of inmates had a current or prior violent or serious felony conviction in California. And what this shows is that especially because the prisons are already overcrowded, if we wanted to release enough prisoners to make room for those more serious offenders, we would still have to release individuals that have been convicted of a serious, violent, or felony offense. So next, and finally, I would like to talk about her third supporting claim, that the early release of prisoners does not harm the state and people. She made a generalization when she cited two trends, one in New York, where they show that decreasing incarceration resulted in decreased crime, and in Georgia, increased incarceration resulted in increased crime. And she made the generalization that this would be nationwide and apply to all the states. However, in particular, if we look at California as a counterexample, Proposition 47 was passed a number of years ago, and this effectively started releasing inmates early from prison. Since this time, the Washington Post states that robberies are up 23% in San Francisco, property theft up 11% in Los Angeles, certain categories of crime rising 20% in Lake Tahoe, 36% in La Mirada, 22% in Chico, and 68% in Desert Hot Springs. This just goes to show that such a cause-effect relationship is not necessarily accurate, and this might have been based on some atypical examples. So I believe that today, from talking about the fact that releasing prisoners will not necessarily save money for the state, that we won't be able to release enough of these less serious offenders to make room for more serious offenders, and the fact that early release of prisoners may actually harm the state to some extent, I have successfully refuted her main claim. Thank you.
All right, you identified the claim and secondary claims pretty clearly. On the first point, you challenged the lack of proof from the advocate on this particular point, and I thought that you did a good job talking about the cost comparisons, finding data about what the spending is like, and just saying, look, the ratio that is being presented is not an accurate depiction of what's going on. And then you followed up with a good explanation about why, even if we did have some savings there, that it would not automatically result in some benefit in some other place, especially given the way the disproportionate spending trends exist. I thought that was pretty solid. Your argument about how we would have a hard time necessarily saving money by releasing people because of mental illness issues, I thought that that's a reasonable claim. I do think that you might want to show that mental health resources are primarily provided by the state, that there would be increased demand on that. That's probably the case, and that we'd have to spend more on that. And I think you could say, I mean, you do say, in essence, that's what's going on. I like that. The other argument that you used, that you followed up with, is that we get 90,000 people who reoffend, and I think that that's a pretty dramatic kind of thing to point out. I think you might want to come back to that on your last point, because when you say when they reoffend, that's 90,000 people who reoffend. That means that there was somebody that they reoffended against, which would explain all of those crimes increases that you're talking about there in that last point. On the space issue, I thought you had excellent evidence that suggested that her information was either outdated or inaccurate, that the problem is less significant than it has been presented. And I thought that you also put it into a good context by pointing out that a substantial number of these people who are in prisons are there because they had violent felony offenses in the past, and that's the thing that, our purpose in having them in prison is to kind of separate them and keep this from happening. And then you get to the third point, which is the logical inference here, and that is that release of all these people is going to have some negative effect. And the advocate says, well, we don't think it has a negative effect because it didn't in New York or Georgia. And I think that that's an interesting point, and it had the opposite effect in Georgia. When we locked them up, there was more crime, that sort of thing. I thought that you said, pretty much said, let's look at California. We've got inconsistencies on the results here. We can look at what's happened based on Proposition 47, which has required the release, and we can see what the subsequent effect has been in major cities in California. You never go so far as to try and make the inference that there's a cause-effect relationship here, but you just say, look, statistically, since this has gone into place, we've had 23% increase in robberies, 11% increase in property crimes. In different cities, you got a whole list of all the crime things that are going up. It would be interesting, by the way, if all those cities were places where there were prisons and people got released into them. I don't know that that's something that there's any correlation with that at all. Maybe you're just cherry picking cities. I don't know what California's total crime rate is, and that might be a little bit of an issue there too. But I thought you had a very good summary, and it challenges the premise of the advocate's argument. All right, thank you. Justin never came back. And the other evaluation form I have is apparently for somebody who's speaking next week. And nobody else is scheduled to speak today? Or at least they're not here? Yeah, that's an issue. That's an issue because we're about to walk out, and I would like to have really gotten in 2 more speeches. This is... it's going to be interesting. We'll see how we do on Monday. It's going to be a little bit tight. All right. Thank you. You guys have a good weekend.